Welcome everybody to this radio shop chat organized by SpectrumX, the NSF Spectrum Innovation Center. My name is Scott Palo. I'm a professor in the Smead Aerospace Department or the Smead Department of Aerospace Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. And before I go ahead and introduce our speaker today, I wanted to provide a couple of reminders. So first, let me remind everybody that SpectrumX is the world's largest academic hub through which all stakeholders can collaborate, innovate, to make the best use of precious radio spectrum to benefit society. And I think, Julia, we need to move to the next slide. There you go. So there's a little bit of information for those who aren't familiar with SpectrumX and who we are, who we collaborate with, and the type of work that we have going on. If you have more questions, you can find that on the website. Second, the purpose of the Radio Shop Chat is to bring together communities to educate, debate, and inspire next steps in collaborative research, workforce development, and policy outreach. And third, the Radio Shop Chats follow Chatham House rule, which means that participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker or speakers will be revealed. Or any of the other participants, may be revealed. The speaker is public. So again, thanks to everybody again for participating. We hope you enjoyed today's Radio Shop Chat, and please spread the word about SpectrumX. Here's some links to our website, our LinkedIn site as well, should you want to follow us and get details. So with that, I'd like to move on and welcome Peter Tenhula. Peter is a leading authority on spectrum policy and interference regulation with nearly 25 years of federal service at the FCC and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, where he most recently served as Deputy Associate Administrator in the Office of Spectrum Management and chaired the Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee. He is currently a Senior Fellow with the Spectrum Policy Initiative at the University of Colorado Boulder, Silicon Flatiron Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship. In today's seminar, Peter draws on original research published in the Colorado Journal of Technology Law to tell the largely untold story of how the concept of harmful interference evolved from its informal use in the early days of radio to the formal definitions adopted after World War II that still shape regulation today. He will shed new light on why this foundational concept remains both influential and controversial. So with that, I would like to welcome Peter to give our Radio Shop Chat today. It's all yours, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. The opportunity to be here. Let me pull up my slides. And good to see everybody. See some friendly faces and names. So let's see. See that okay?
We can, and you are sharing. Yep, we're good to go.
All right. Scott mentioned this is about an article that I published with my co-author Carl Frank. Here's the actual publication to prove it's real, and there's a copy of the thing. I'll put a link. Actually, put a link in the chat and at the end to the article itself if you haven't found it yet or want to read it later. It's been a kind of a long journey to get this thing published. I'm going to go into kind of the motivation of what goes behind this. Who are the kind of the critics, the influences, and the references that we relied on, and talk about some of the methodology and our results from this kind of detailed exploration into this history. We'll talk about the current terminology and definitions, and offer a riddle, kind of along the lines of the chicken and the egg, of which came first, interference or harmful interference. And get into the kind of the details of where this thing all came from. Got a few historic timelines just to track the history and the dates of when various events happened, the development of the definitions themselves, and some conclusions, observations, and I think of interest to hopefully those mostly the academics on the call, some recommendations for further research, stuff that was recommended to us but was a little over our head, because it's kind of more technical in nature. Without further ado, talk about the motivation. Friend and colleague Chuck Jackson did a paper in 2016 at the TPRC conference, and I went up to him afterwards. He talked about this things going back to the late 1800s and the 1900s and stuff, and he said, talked about this interference, and he goes, he tried to define it from back then, and he couldn't. So I asked him, well, then what happened? Where this definition come from? And he couldn't answer my question. So I kind of started looking it up myself. I was working at NTA at the time. I asked Carl Frank, who was working there, to see if he could try to trace the origins of the definitions. There was some I2 radio regulations that were identified, the current ones, and just started digging in kind of how did the language develop, involving interference. But then I kind of at the same time I retired from NTIA and started looking at some books and articles on the early radio history, and none of those address the definitions, any specific context. So these are some of the references which I recommend as very informative sources, and that we cite throughout the article as well. And they kind of talk about, how radio regulation evolved, but didn't really give a clue about kind of where these definitions came from. A couple of these folks tried to interpret or understand the definitions, and didn't really do a good. I don't think they did a real good job of describing it. So it kind of gave me the green light to kind of delve into it and write this article. So other influencers and references include Mitchell Lazarus, who commented on the definition of harmful interference in a presentation, and he did a blog on it. Everybody's criticizing it of being, a lot of people criticizing it, including Mitchell, about it being being vague and subjective. Said, and he also, said that a quantitative, forward-looking, predictable definition may not be feasible. Though IEEE USA suggested ways to clarify the definition of harmful interference, why it's a problem. Mike Marcus followed up with an article in Proceedings IEEE. It said, this definition goes back a long time. Not sure when, but it should be changed. And a lot of criticism about the uncertainties, ambiguities of the definition, how it may delay, introduction of innovative technologies. So, what was the thinking? So others were embracing the definition, including the Spectrum Policy Task Force, or criticizing the definition. The Spectrum Policy Task Force has actually said, and I was there at the time, hey, this is a good flexible definition. It works just fine. And Paul Margie said same thing in the Stanford Technological Law Review in 2003. So, in light of this kind of background, and J.P. DeVries, colleague at University of Colorado, also came up with some ideas about the harm claims threshold. So, with this as kind of a motivation, started digging in and realized in this digital archives, starts go back to 1903. This is a kind of example screenshot of the documents that are available. And I again recommend going back and digging through these documents. The issue was, a lot of them are in French, some of them are English, right? So, and or some are translations from the French to English. So that's where Carl was helpful in that respect because he spoke French and understood the French and understood, and started looking at this and going, hey, some of these translations or misinterpretations maybe don't make sense. So we looked at that and we actually compared and tracked and went through the evolution of the language itself. Going back to the 1903, 1906 conferences and looking ahead to when the definition was adopted. The first definition of harmful interference was adopted in the Atlantic City Conference in 1947. And you see the volume of documentation increased substantially over that time. So we were digging through all of this, and I had a research assistant at the time that helped out, going through these things, and we're looking for kind of the needles in the haystack of when the definitions were discussed and deliberated on, and what was the thinking behind it, what the various proposals were, things like that. So it kind of just shows the volume of information and documentation that we're kind of digging through. And you can see how the definition kind of evolved, from 1947 to 1959, but I'm not going to spoil the punchline to my riddle, which again, showing the volume of stuff, showing the language. Just the background, we back up a little bit. We did two versions of this paper. The first paper we presented in 2022 at the TPRC conference. It's kind of like a working paper version, and attached to that working paper version is an appendix which has all this language.
Peter?
Chart. Yeah.
Can I interrupt? Ashley has her hand up. I want to give Ashley the mic and let her ask her question, if that's okay.
Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Peter. Yeah, thanks. One quick question. Did you come at all across when detrimental interference first showed up? Because we did note that in the current radio regs, in the English, there's a distinction between detrimental interference and harmful interference, but it's the same French word. And I thought the French was the root and tried to sort of change the English so that it always just used harmful. And I was curious historically when detrimental crept in and if that was part of the analysis. Thanks.
Yeah, detrimental was part of it. It was French was like interference detrimental. And there's one of the early uses of it, and there's lots of various uses of types of modifiers. Like one was serious interference that had been used in the radio regulations early on. That's what we were kind of talking about, the various translations, interpretations of that, and how, and one of them was the detrimental. I don't think I have it on any of the slides. I thought I did, but I could pinpoint exactly when that language was, and I'll look through the article if you.
So maybe I'll follow up on that, Peter. Does detrimental interference and that terminology continue today, or was it something that appeared and then got harmonized to be considered, harmful interference? And, is there any indication on the difference between the two? Or was it sort of people being inexact with the language?
Yeah. There was all kinds of, in the Cairo conference, the phrase interference detrimental to the operations was used. If it's still in the regulations, I don't recall where it is. And if it's used throughout, there's other, like the FCC has come up with a ton of other things like objectionable interference. What were the other ones? Lots of other phrase, words other than harmful. And I have a theory behind that, but I can get into that at the end. So, other questions about kind of the methodology and motivation, I can kind of talk about where my riddle. You'd think, which I thought, which came first, interference or harmful interference? Well, obviously, the use of the term interference was very common up, in the early decades, from the early 1900s to the 40s. But the word harmful interference, which, the word interference is part of the definition. So, okay, you get interference, harmful interference. They must have occurred at the same time, right? No. 1947 was a harmful interference definition. And then 1979, interference was defined by the ITU. So why did that happen? How did it happen that way? How did that evolve from the basically the specific type of interference to harmful to the general interference? And I could go through and dissect this language for the next 2 hours and try to understand what it means. And I'm going to highlight some aspects of this language, but really, and we do in the paper, quite a bit, and dissect kind of how it evolved and how the words changed. But I'm just going to I'll let everybody take it in for now and memorize, because I had it memorized at one point, but I've lost it. So in 1979, but to kind of answer the question, well, why? Why did they come with the definition of interference when they had this definition of harmful interference? Well, then they came up with these levels. And the reason they came up with harmful interference in the first place is because they started using it throughout the whole ITU regulations. And then they came up, so then they came up, sorry, in the 70s, mainly in the satellite context, they wanted to figure out levels or a hierarchy of interference. And this is where they came up with not just definition of interference, but also these two other levels, permissible interference and accepted interference. However, there was a footnote attached to these two levels. The footnote is that the asterisks there were that these terms are used in coordination of frequency assignments between administrations. But you don't really see, and you don't see a lot of these terms actually being used in the regulations themselves. But that's the answer to the riddle. But so here we are from 1970s, and that's kind of what they were implemented by the FCC in the 1980s, kind of as is, as a current regulator, and that's kind of what we have now. And this is the current definition. Okay, so here we are. That's today. Let's go back. So this is the historic timeline. I'm not a historian, but I play one on TV, and I pretended to be. So I guess the way historians look at these things, they come up with timelines. So I got a short version and a long version. The short version is basically divides the timeline between before and after World War II. And so pre-World War II, there's lots of uses of the words interference, but no definitions. Like I said, they use phrases like serious interference from 1927, other modifiers, maybe detrimental, but not harmful. And there were various translations and descriptions. Then 1947, was the first radio conference after World War II. A lot of preparation went into that. And a big debate during that discussion, where the only real debate about was whether to include induction in the definition. But also I would highlight this last phrase that which is important, I think, that the service that is being interrupted or affected, I call it in other words, the victim, would be operating in accordance with IT regulations, right? So it's kind of like a question is, you can't interfere, you're not causing harm to a service that is not, not operating in accordance with the regulations. That is, and maybe it's unauthorized, maybe it's operating, outside of the regulations, who knows? So it's not harmful according to that original definition, and according to the current definition, it's still not operating. And then in 1959, it was tweaked to add the word emission. Wow, I guess that was an oversight to begin with, but engineers can talk about whether that was a crucial oversight or not. Is radiation and emission the same thing? Why was induction there? I got all these questions when we first presented the paper and tried to figure it out. Back in 1947, the US actually did not like the inclusion of induction in the definition because it was basically opening the door to regulate things like car engines and spark plugs and things like that. They thought that's what they said in the objection. I guess the objection was overcome, or they got rid of it eventually, and induction stayed in, and it's still in. In 1959, they added the word radio communication before service because I guess that became a defined service as well. As a side note, I was also trying to figure out, okay, well, how does this affect services that are not a radio communication service, like radio astronomy, right? And I know, like Ashley and others, I may have talked about with this, but I figured it out. But there's a kind of roundabout way of how you get harmful interference to a non-radio communication service like radio astronomy, and there's just other provisions in the ITU regulations that bring that around. The 1979 again is where you get the definition of interference, permissible interference, and accepted interference. That's the short version. The long version is going back to pre-World War II. Is when you got, obviously the early radio development and regulatory recommendations, where you got Navy and others talking about, their experiences in developing radio technology and what they were experiencing as they test these things, what kind of interference that they're talking about. And I would say my reading of this language back then and their use of it is that interference meant harmful interference. And by harmful interference, it meant it made one system, it caused other system to stop working, and sorry, my throat. So these are the detailed kind of events that happened during this first era, where the word interference or interfere was being used in various laws, from 1912 in the U.S. and conventions, and the Radio Act 1927. Just as a side note, that's when 1927, also when the first table of frequency allocations was used, developed as a guide. And then that's where it said services capable of serious international interference had to conform with the international regulations. 1932, interesting. That's when the ITU was officially established from two different organizations. And then you got the Communications 34, which basically brought in the 1927 Act. Cairo, involves some, finally, according to Carl, the French, use of the words kind of were harmonized or at least slimmed down because they were using all kinds of different words. Post World War II, more detailed. So Atlantic City, again, where the harmful interference definition came up, that it was part of a proposal, I think, from the U.S. That involved a lot of planning, post-war planning, to come up with a new allocation table. It was basically chaos during the war, and so they needed to figure out a way to get things. And there was a huge change in the at the ITU, a complete revamp of how the assignments and stuff were recorded. There was a new board, IFRB, created. Lots of bureaucracy, and then you see basically the word harmful interference occurring all throughout the international regulations. So that there was some working groups at the conference that were tasked with developing a definition, and they were not given a lot of time to do that. And our article goes through kind of the more granular timeline during that conference in Atlantic City, of when and how they came up with the terminology and the kind of pressure they were under. And I understand it's commonplace now too, but in the late night meetings, that resulted in the final definition, in the various positions that various countries were taking, and we go through that detail in the article. So the first use of harmful interference as a phrase in U.S. law didn't come about until 1965, 1968 amendments. And then, as I mentioned, I did not mention this. Then, prior to the 1979 work, leading up to that was they had a space work, where this is where these levels of interference were originally proposed. And there's lots of study done by the CCIR, which is kind of the precursor to the current study groups that you have at the ITU, and these various CCR conferences in 74, 78 really delved into this topic of the definitions. And it also talked about noise, issues, very technical discussions, and which we highlight, kind of some of them. There's a couple articles that I'll mention at the end that went through all the various proposals and ideas too. And then it was really at the very end of that the conference in 1979 where you got these new interference definitions, and this footnote that USSR proposed, which then limited it to this coordination among the agencies, which is still the current footnote that limits those to what called the intermediate levels interference. It took a few years for the FCC to implement the 1979 work, but it's this 1983 rulemaking is what is the current. You look at those, and that's the current definitions right there. And so we didn't go past that time. That was kind of the last event we looked at. So any questions about that quick historical overview before I get into conclusions, recommendations?
We can open the floor for a moment here for anybody. Comments or questions on the historical overview? Welcome to raise your hand or drop a note in the chat.
Any challenges to the facts? How about that? Who was there in 1979?
I Ashley has her hand up. I think Ashley's spent some time thinking about this problem and doing some research. So
Yeah.
Ashley, go ahead.
So I was not there in 1979. I was born that year, but I do have a question for you, Peter. Um, I was curious what your impression is on the whole question of harmful interference that's being caused by things that are not intended emissions. Because this is one of the challenges that we're currently facing, right? Like satellites have a lot of electronics on board, so there's a lot of unintended emissions, interference that's coming from just radiation, induction, all of the electronics on board, like the thrusters, things like that. And we're actually having a really hard time thinking through an approach that everybody agrees on, like within the United States. And so I was curious, just from that historic perspective, we've been trying to like find examples in the radio regs. And of course, Jonathan has pointed out like broadband over power cause interference, right? To some other, there's examples, they seem so limited. So yeah, I was just curious, like what lessons learned you might, have examples that might be relevant for that issue today.
I don't have any offhand other than, recognizing that there are so many provisions. This led me to think about the other provisions and where they came from, including provisions on the regulation of what it used to be called industrial interference. I can't remember what it's called now, but so there's all kinds of these provisions where they came from, and that's one of them. And I think that there's this, FCC uses this concept of unintentional emitters, right, in Part 15, which I think is, they and their authority, to do that came out of Section 302 of the Communications Act. But they were doing it even before, as soon as spark plugs became a problem, they were looking at, at how to regulate that and or how to, figure that out. So I don't know, and if they basically said that, well, these things are causing harmful interference, but they basically said is that we got to figure out a way, like Part 15, to make sure that these things do not cause harmful or not. And so that's Section 302 of the Communications Act says, it gives the FCC jurisdiction over anything that is capable of causing harmful interference, right? Of course, Congress didn't define harmful interference, but since the FCC already had a definition at the time that Section 302 was enacted, you could infer that, okay, that's what they meant by harmful interference, even by unintentional emitters. But we didn't really get into kind of the history of that application or use of the words yet, but we do suggest, that there's definitely there's room for lots of further research in this area of the application of the definition in various contexts.
All right. Well, we have a couple of additional questions, Peter. You're sparking some conversation.
Hey, Rick.
Rick, go ahead.
Peter, so can you, what I'm going to ask, but when did the issue of safety services get involved with this whole definition? Because I think that's an important thing that I've been through and fought, lost, won, depends on what's, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I know. And like I said, I didn't want to dissect the language, but there's two standards in the definition, right? One for radio navigation and safety, right, and one for everything else. I go back to the language. I'll pull up the language in a minute. But the safety aspect of it, there wasn't a definition of. Sorry, going back too far. Endangers the functioning of radio navigation service or other safety services. The safety services had its own definition, right? That was always there from the start. So was radio navigation. The language, for harmful interference included that this kind of two-pronged thing. The question is, from an interpretation standpoint, do those services have to be operating in accordance with the regulation? Right? So you ask a lawyer or even law student, you say, well, a lot of times when you interpret like language like this in a law or regulation, you say you apply that phrase to both things, right? So that's a question. But yeah, there was a proposal back in the 70s when they were developing these other levels of interference to do away with radio navigation service in the definition, because they thought radio navigation was encompassed within safety services. So then the question becomes, well, what does endangers the functioning mean, right? Okay, but if you look at, let's say, I'll give an example of a recent case where the FCC is applying this definition, and it's talking about performance degradation. Whether it's asking the question whether or not there was serious performance degradation to GPS. Well, that's the wrong question. The question should be whether or not it's endangering the function of GPS, right? So this is why we'll go back and understand the origins of this definition is, I think, important. And then there's and Rick and we've talked about this notion of technical definitions and regulatory definitions. And I cite the National Academy's work on this that had the same dilemma. Well, we've got technical definitions, we've got regulatory definitions. Which one should we, focus on?
So let me ask you, there other part of that, you touched on this, is about operating in accordance with the standards or the research. Because that's another, that was another problem I've been through in that, and then a couple other things about, if you're not operating in accordance with the thing, well, can you be harmfully interfered with? If you're not operating within the rules, is it possible to be interfered with? That's the other.
From a legal perspective, I looked at that, and I'm not the only one. There was a scholar who some of you may know, Leave, can't remember his first name, who kind of pointed this out as kind of a condition, and I call it the conformity condition in this bullet. And I think at least in the cases I'm familiar with, there was never a kind of implementation of that condition, kind of a prerequisite. But if you're a lawyer and your client's being accused of causing harmful interference, you're going to say back, but they're not in conformity with the radio regulations. So I can't be causing harmful interference with them because they're not complying with the regulations. It's kind of like you could say it's an affirmative defense in the legal context. I'm not aware of any cases that have pointed to that language. Just one law review article that I'm aware of, and one book that I'm aware of that highlighted it.
So we've got Lindsay with her hand up, and Philippe had a comment in the chat. Maybe what I'll do is I'll give Lindsay an opportunity to ask her question. We'll give the floor back to Peter to wrap up, to talk about sort of his call to action for research here, and then we can follow up with some more questions, and I'll bring Philippe's question to the floor. So Lindsay.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for digging into the history of this. I found this fascinating and really enlightening. I'm curious, while you were looking through, you teased some applications to radio astronomy. And my specific question about that is, if you investigated, particularly in radio astronomy, there's maximum permissible data loss. And if I Google like harmful interference to radio astronomy, it's at least on the CRAF website defined in terms of a data loss threshold. And I've been thinking through, whether or not, I mean, two parts to my question. One, if you uncovered ways that that data loss should be calculated, is it over time? Is it in one night? Is it permission, sort of a thing, the
Right.
scope? And the other question is, I've actually seen some conflicting information. Some people say 2%, 5%, 10%. I
Mm-hmm.
was wondering if you could comment on that too.
Yeah, again, we had the exact kind of questions and comments when we first presented this, as a working paper. And that's kind of the area where we kind of gave up on, because there's so many. I'm aware of one instance where the FCC attempted to quantify harmful interference, and that was in the case involving a service called MVDDS, and that they determined that, and it was a terrestrial service that shared the DBS spectrum, direct broadcast satellite spectrum, and in that case, they determined that 10% outage would be harmful interference. 10% outage of the direct broadcast satellite, and that was kind of the first and only time that I'm aware of where actual harmful interference definition was used and quantified to determine, what was a substantial degradation. So, but at every time, and I'm not aware of any times where the FCC has adopted technical rules that tied, their conclusion that this prevents harmful interference to any of the elements of that definition, at least the FCC side. On the international or radio astronomy side, again, I'm not aware of any type of efforts to quantify it, but that's where I urged more research, in this area, because how, early on, at least the ITU attempted maybe to implement those two levels, of interference that weren't harmful. That's what I'm here to. The primary reason I'm here is actually to encourage that research, because that how does it go back, especially early on, like in the 70s and 80s, when they were trying to implement these definitions, how they did it, because that's what they claim that they needed is more quantification to do it. And there were efforts to do it, like, you hear about the Rick familiar with the approach used in the GPS context, and that so-called threshold or interference protection criteria. What was the nexus developed between the language of the definition and the interference protection criteria that was established, for that particular, service? And I hope, hope somebody can do that. But like I said, those levels and hierarchy that was established, I haven't seen them being used, at least in the regulations. So one conclusion is that I hope this historical context sheds light on the modern day techniques, and perhaps it was because of the minimal analysis or attention deliberation when it was originally adopted or modified. Maybe there wasn't a lot of buy-in into these definitions in the first place. That's one theory. Obviously, I talked about the frustrations with qualitative nature that have been around since the 70s. But the solutions or proposals, they don't appear to be workable yet. So, I mentioned a couple examples I'm familiar with, like interference temperature and harm claim threshold. And then, and I mentioned earlier about, like the hand wringing over technical versus the regulatory legal types of definitions. These two papers by Hagen, I cite one of them in the article, the 1977 version, which is long. It's actually an IRAC document I found, that was presented at a NATO conference. And then Hagen later, in 1979, in a IEEE publication, did a shorter version of it leading up to the 1979 conference. But he makes a lot of great points in his papers, but it'd be great from a technical standpoint to kind of follow up the IEEE and other technical definitions and how those all kind of maybe in parallel evolved over time. Like I said, I mentioned the National Academy's report in 2022 that also kind of threw up their hands, it seems like, when they were confronted with a technical and a regulatory legal definition. I think my recollection is, Rick, they went with the technical one. So follow-up research suggestions, again, the historical and analytical review of the technical quantitative approaches for defining, or implementing, I should say, these levels or types of interference, in the 70s and 80s. And then take a look at, the IEEE, and before that, the IRE, was International Radio. The Institute of Radio Engineering, IRE. And then other, I can list a million things, but the only ones we put in the paper are these two. And then the second one is the table of allocations, which was asserted as a way of preventing harmful interference. And what was the history and effectiveness of that? And that's actually I'm engaged in that research right now with a student at University of Colorado, and hope to be presenting a paper on that in September. And with that, if there are any more questions, if you guys want to download the paper, there's the link if you haven't already, or scan the QR code. Let's see. And I'll post it in the chat too.
Excellent. Thank you. We have about, 7 minutes or so here for discussion before we hit the top of the hour. I'll provide that there's been an ongoing dialogue here on the
I see it. Yeah.
on the chat. I will comment. Charles Cooper indicated that in the broadcast service with past DTV repack, there were also interference metrics. He pointed out Bob Weller, who is on the call here, and gave a thumbs up. So, don't know if Peter, you had any other comments there on the DTV repack and the interference metrics. And then
I'd love to see if they use the language in the definitions, when they were, coming up with those metrics. Go back. It's going to be serious. This will seriously degrade or repeatedly interrupt. Is that language that was used in coming up with those metrics? I don't think so, because I've looked for that language in all FCC decisions.
Right. Okay. And then Philippe, I know you had a comment and have your hand up, so go right ahead.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for everyone. My name is Felipe Nazario Romero. I'm lead engineer for the Acquisition Spectrum Management Office in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And recently we have within our office a concern that I would like to reach out to Mr. Tenhula later, since he has experience with the FCC and TIA, and maybe it's across the border for everybody. We have come across equipment spectrum certification, which is a process to quantify and qualify each one of the pieces of equipment to ensure that they comply with the letter of the law when it comes to spectrum management. And we provide the information for certification. And sometimes we get some questions back saying, yeah, there is a possibility that your system can interfere with our system in these bands. So we do the analysis and we do the budget link and we verify what is the noise floor level of the receiver that is in concern. And we come across saying, yeah, our level is way below of the area of concern that you have, and we provide this information to the people who have the question. But some of the responses that we have is, yes, but you still can't interfere.
Yeah.
And we're like, yeah, but we just demonstrated mathematically, at least with the information and data that we have, that we're way below that. But still, they say, but yeah, but you can still interfere. And sometimes it's a way to find a common ground. So that's why I would like to reach out to you maybe later to verify how we can sit down and address some of these definitions of interference, just to make sure that it's across the border. The purpose of our office, besides doing that, is creating training and awareness to our community. And so far, we've been doing that for 3 years. Over 2,000 people have been trained. And now that this topic has come across, I think it's a good point for me to learn a little bit more about it and have your insight, so I can address it to the community that we provide the service to, so they're able to understand where we're going from. Over.
Okay, Charles, you get that? I don't work at NTA anymore, thank God. And so, but I will. I think Charles and other folks from NTA heard you and loud and clear, because I think that's a kind of an issue that I remember confronting. When I was there, is that just because it meets some kind of preordained interference protection criteria from how many decades ago or years ago it was developed, doesn't mean that it's gonna prevent harmful interference in every single case. So if you meet that criteria as a transmitter, and you can, and you say, okay, we met this criteria, this threshold, whatever it is, and out of band, in band, whatever the case may be. But if there's still if there's still other systems that are being harmed because maybe they came online after that IPC was developed, is there, what's the, if it's outside, let's call it like a safe harbor, how does from a lawyer's perspective, when you're confronted with that case, how do you shift a burden, right, of proving that if you say, well, we've met this interference protection criteria, what else could we do? Their claim we're still causing interference. Well, okay, then the burden maybe shifts, to the victim side to say, well, we're operating in conformance with all the regulations too, but we're still. And it reminds me of a situation that came up at the FCC involving 800 megahertz. I won't go into details of it, but that's what happens when technology evolves and develops after you've adopted, the technical rules, and maybe those technical rules weren't good enough. I think Monisha's got a question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peter. This was fascinating. So one of the things that the criteria that is very often used for harmful interference is the -6 dB I over,
Yes.
right? The interference to noise criteria. And I think
I'll try not to mention that. It gives me hives.
Yeah, and so it goes back to, okay, -6 dB I over N corresponds to 1 dB degradation in SNR. So it's a good number that, okay, you can cause as much interference as degrade your SNR by a dB. And I'm now strictly talking about active systems, not about passive systems. A 1 degree degradation in SNR is harmful if you're at the edge. If you're on the cliff of the SNR and you move 1 dB, yes, you will degrade.
Right.
You already have a link margin of 30 dB. A 1 dB SNR is not harmful interference. And so I wonder what your thoughts are as to moving to a signal to interference noise ratio criteria for harmful interference versus an I over N ratio for harmful interference. And why has that not been something that's been considered in more systems?
That's the key question. And I know, and that's like, for example, Dale Hatfield, after we did the working paper, suggested doing a kind of an appendix, the technical opinions that talked about this and SINR. In fact, we had some language in there originally about that as a mechanism for quantifying as an basically interference protection criteria that quantified or defined what harmful interference is. But then we couldn't connect it. We couldn't find a nexus between the actual words, the definition. Say how is that? There might be it out there somewhere. I just haven't found it. In any of the tech, it says, okay, so if it's -6, this is why it seriously degrades. We tried to do this in the technical report in the GPS context that when NTIA submitted that to FCC to talk about, we focus on the endangering the function concept. Because this was GPS and that how many they quantified in the case based on the sample, how many devices were actually impacted, when it was at that threshold, right? And then when it was below that threshold or above that threshold, so there were some measurements taken, there and some quantification done that says, okay, but and the functions, what are the functions that were, that were impacted or endangered by that? So that's the key that I think the technical side of this research would be to kind of like say, and then also to say, well, endangering the function is something that we can't necessarily define. We need to go further, right, and have a kind of more elaboration maybe on and what this all means. That'd be my suggestion.
Yeah, I think with the SINR, you basically now need to know a lot more about the receiver you're interfering with. What is the SINR threshold? Whereas with -6 dB, you can just use a single number for every system out there, and it's easier from a regulation point of view to do that. But it can, over constrain what another device can be doing.
So
exactly, and I would then make sure everybody is aware that the definition of interference in regulation talks about the effect upon reception.
Yeah.
Right. And so everybody argues, hey, there's no authority to regulate receivers. Yes, there is, right here.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna jump in here because I know we're just a little past the top of the hour. I'm sure we could continue this discussion for an extended period of time.
Sure.
And I hope we can at future meetings and in-person engagement that we have opportunities to connect on with everybody here on the call. So I wanted to wrap up and once again thank Peter for a great conversation and a really great interaction here. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for taking the time to do the research and then taking the time to educate all of us. So it's a wonderful opportunity. And then for everybody else that's on the call, we're currently actively working to schedule future radio shop chat speakers. So stay tuned. We expect to have some more speakers on our schedules soon. So before I do the final sign off, Peter, any final words you'd like to leave us with?
Please reach out. I put my email in the chat and the link to the paper if you have any further questions or any ideas. And if you're actually serious about on the technical side of the research side, I've got some references already, that we looked into and, early publications and, IRE that might be helpful to get folks started. If you have a student who's interested, let me know.
Excellent. Thank you. And again, if you want to connect with SpectrumX, the website's spectrumx.org. Feel free to connect with us. We're always looking for broadening our partnerships. So with that, we'll wrap up today. And again, thanks everybody for attending. And thanks again, Peter. Take care.
Take care, everybody.